The chandeliers of the Eclat Vogue showroom sparkled like constellations suspended midair. Inside, the air buzzed with champagne laughter, camera clicks, and the scent of imported orchids. Every corner of the room was curated: sleek marble floors, gold-accented fixtures, and mannequins dressed in the season's untouchable couture. And then the elevator doors opened. Isha stepped out, her simple beige cotton kurta a dull echo against the saturated luxury around her. She paused for a moment, blinking under the sharp studio lights, gripping the strap of her worn leather handbag. Her flats tapped softly against the cold marble as she walked in, head held high, though her eyes darted quickly, nervously, trying to make sense of the space she once knew so well. The crowd parted unconsciously, like the sea resisting an intruder. An influencer in a sequin pantsuit raised a sculpted eyebrow. A cluster of interns near the front desk whispered, their eyes trailing the visible wear on Isha's kurta hem. Someone giggled. "She must be with catering," someone muttered under their breath. Isha heard it, she swallowed. But she kept walking. At the heart of the room, framed by flashing cameras and a cascade of tulle dresses on mannequins, stood Natasha Verma, a vision in a jet-black blazer dress dripping in Cartier. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek knot, her smile poised and photogenic. Years had barely touched her since Isha last saw her, still statuesque, still dangerous. Isha stopped a few feet away, just close enough to be noticed, just far enough to not invite conversation. For a fleeting moment, Natasha didn't recognize her, but when she did, her expression froze, then twisted into something vaguely amused. "Well," Natasha said loudly, her voice slicing through the murmurs like a scalpel, "look what the cat dragged in." A few heads turned, a few cameras tilted slightly. Isha met her eyes, silent. Natasha tilted her head, circling slowly like a lioness bored by her prey. "I'd ask who you're wearing," she said with mock seriousness, "but I don't think we've ever had a collaboration with Fab India, have we?" Laughter exploded behind her like a firecracker, harsh, unfiltered. Isha didn't flinch, but her fingers gripped her bag tighter. "You know," Natasha continued, walking a slow circle around her, "it's brave, no, heroic to show up here like this. Most people would understand that Eclat Vogue doesn't exactly cater to charity cases." Click flash, a paparazzo had found the moment irresistible. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Isha said softly, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. "Oh, I'm sure you're not," Natasha purred. "Trouble doesn't usually wear open-toed flats in February." More laughter, someone clapped, the energy turned electric, cruel, caffeinated. Isha felt every eye land on her like a dart. But she didn't turn to leave. Instead, she looked Natasha dead in the eye, her voice calm and chilling in contrast. "You haven't changed, Natasha," still mistaking cruelty for charisma. There was a beat of silence. Natasha's eyes narrowed just briefly before she smoothed her expression into her signature smile, the one she wore for press interviews and award speeches. "Well," she said with a theatrical sigh, "some people evolve, others attend events they weren't invited to." She motioned toward security with a lazy flick of her hand. Two guards began to walk toward Isha, unsure, hesitant. She held up a small envelope. "I have a press pass," Isha said, "under Isha R Designs. I registered this morning." The guards paused. Natasha's smile faltered for a split second, a micro-expression, but Isha saw it. "You're still in fashion?" Natasha asked, feigning disbelief. "Is that what we're calling DIY Instagram posts these days?" "I'm here to observe," Isha said, "like everyone else." Natasha stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper just between them. "You think showing up here will make you matter again?" she said. "You're a relic, a ghost, and soon you'll be nothing." Isha smiled, not broadly but deeply. "I came to see the empire," she said, "before it crumbles." Before Natasha could respond, a journalist's voice cut through the tension. "Ms. Verma, can we get a quote for Vogue India?" Natasha turned with a manufactured smile, and Isha used the moment to walk away, blending into the crowd that didn't know whether to sneer or stare. She found a quiet corner and stood tall, her heart racing. They could laugh. They could whisper. But they wouldn't forget. Not after tonight. It had started with a sketch. Isha remembered the moment with painful clarity, seated on the floor of her tiny Mumbai apartment, a steaming cup of chai beside her, the ceiling fan sputtering overhead. Her hands, calloused from endless stitching, moved instinctively, gliding her pencil across paper. The dress she drew that evening would change everything, or so she thought. Back then, Asha was a rising star. Fresh from design school, she had landed a coveted internship under Natasha Verma, the queen of Indian haute couture. Eclat Vogue was the temple and Natasha its high priestess. For Asha, the internship wasn't just a career move, it was a miracle. At first, Natasha had seemed like a godsend, stern, yes, but visionary. She noticed Asha's attention to detail, praised her stitching technique, and once even said, "You've got an eye I haven't seen in years." Asha had floated on that praise for weeks. Their dynamic shifted the day Natasha asked Asha to stay late. "Design me something fresh," she'd said, tapping a blank mood board. "Minimalist, but statement. We need something for Milan." Asha had stayed up all night. She sketched, stitched a prototype with scrap fabric, even added hand-embroidered beadwork to the neckline. When she nervously presented it the next morning, Natasha barely blinked. She took the folder, nodded absently, and said, "Let's see what we can do." 2 weeks later, Asha watched Natasha unveil the exact same design on the runway in Milan. Same silhouette, same beadwork. Only this time the label read, "A Natasha Verma Original." Asha hadn't been invited to the show. She had seen it on Instagram. The betrayal hollowed her out like acid, but worse was the silence. When she confronted Natasha privately, the woman didn't flinch. "This is how the industry works," Natasha had said smoothly, sipping wine in her corner office. "You're an intern, you don't get credit, you get experience." Asha's voice had cracked. "You stole it." Natasha had smiled thinly. "Grow up." She didn't tell anyone at first. She wasn't stupid. Natasha's influence could crush her career before it started. But the guilt festered. Every time she passed that dress, now rebranded as the Verma curve, displayed in Vogue spreads, on billboards, on celebrities, it felt like a blade twisting in her side. There was one person she thought she could trust, Priya. Priya had been Asha's best friend since college. They'd shared everything: hostels, heartbreaks, instant noodles, dreams. Priya was working at a fashion PR agency and had always told Asha, "When you make it, I make it too." So when Asha finally broke down and told her what happened, Priya hugged her and promised to help. "You have to speak out," she said. "I'll make sure it gets published. I'll talk to editors anonymously." Relief had poured through Asha like rain after a drought. But the article never came out. Instead, days later, Natasha held a press conference claiming someone had tried to sabotage her Milan collection. Screenshots of messages Asha had supposedly sent were leaked, suggesting she was unstable, desperate, jealous. None of it was true, but the narrative stuck. And Priya, she ghosted her. Blocked her number. Never replied to her emails. The final blow came in the form of a letter, a formal blacklisting notice from the Indian Fashion Federation, without explanation. No brand would touch her, no school would take her on as a mentor. She became a pariah, spoken about only in whispers, with phrases like "too much drama" or "not a team player." Asha packed her things and left Mumbai. For months, she didn't draw a single design. Her sketchbooks gathered dust in her parents' home in Pune, tucked under her bed like relics from another life. She took a job teaching textile basics at a local co-op, stitched blouses for aunties in the neighborhood. She smiled politely. She shrank. But some embers never die. One afternoon, while flipping through a tattered fashion magazine at a tea stall, she saw it, Natasha posing beside a new launch, a revolutionary sustainable fashion line. One of the featured pieces had her patchwork signature, Asha's exact reverse dye motif, the design she'd once shown Priya in confidence. It wasn't anger that bloomed inside her. It was clarity. They hadn't buried her, they built an empire on her bones. And she was still here. Asha went home that night and dusted off her sketchbook. Her hand trembled at first, but the lines began to flow again, bolder this time, less apologetic. A friend from the co-op offered to photograph her designs. A cousin helped her set up an Instagram page, Asha R Designs. She started with one post, then another. A year later, she had a quiet but growing audience. Orders began to trickle in, small collaborations, a blog feature. Then a message came from a new magazine covering rising indie designers. "Would you like a press pass to Eclat Vogue's winter launch?" She stared at the email for a long time. It wasn't revenge she wanted. It was to be seen. Be unerased. Asha stood quietly in the far corner of the grand showroom, near a decorative vase that smelled more like power than flowers. The show had begun. The lights dimmed slowly, and a synthetic bass line spread through the space like smoke. Phones were raised high as a uniform wave of anticipation swept the room. All eyes were fixed on the runway as Natasha Verma stepped into the spotlight, elegant and untouchable, dressed in sculpted black silk and surrounded by a digital cascade of her latest designs. The crowd responded with polite applause, but it wasn't admiration, it was obedience. She commanded it like a conductor with no need for a baton. Asha, unnoticed by most, tried to blend into the wall. She didn't have a seat or an official badge around her neck. Her name wasn't printed on any list. What she did have was a silent fury and a pass, printed, folded, and hidden in her bag like a secret waiting for the right moment. As the models began walking the runway, each looked more extreme than the last. Something in Asha's body turned cold. One model emerged in a heavy, textured jacket with a raised collar and embroidery down the lapel, an intricate pattern stitched with the precision of someone who had done it hundreds of times before. Asha's breath caught. That design was hers, not just vaguely similar, it was exact. Asha had created that motif in her small Pune apartment, sent it as a proposal to a boutique months ago, and received no reply. Now here it was, parading down Eclat Vogue's runway, rebranded as Natasha's latest innovation. She felt her throat tighten. The betrayal wasn't a wound anymore, it was an infection that had spread too deep. Her first instinct was to walk away, disappear before the humiliation thickened again, but the fire in her chest demanded otherwise. She stood straighter. Then, without warning, someone tapped her shoulder. The grip was firm and unkind. It was a security guard asking her to step out. He was followed by another, both of them repeating in practiced tones that this was a private event and that several attendees had raised concerns about her presence. Asha tried to reason with them, showing the paper pass, explaining she had been invited through a digital press request. They looked at it briefly, unimpressed, and insisted again that she had to leave. As this exchange unfolded, more heads turned toward her, phones angled in her direction. A ripple of murmurs and smirks moved through the crowd. Then, as if summoned by the scent of drama, Priya appeared. Dressed in satin and dipped in artificial sympathy, she acted shocked to see Asha there. But the act was thin. Her eyes flicked toward Natasha across the room, and in that flicker, Asha saw the truth. Priya was part of it. What followed was not an argument, but a quiet, calculated humiliation. The guards didn't touch her, but they surrounded her. Priya's voice rose just enough for others to hear her express concern, to subtly frame Asha as someone unstable, inappropriate, desperate. The audience began to devour the scene, not with concern but amusement. Someone nearby whispered cruelly. Another influencer began live streaming. Asha could feel the weight of their judgment settling on her like wet cement. Then Natasha entered the circle with that slow, deliberate walk that she had perfected over years of being worshipped. Her voice was laced with faux grace as she suggested Asha be allowed to speak, to have her moment. The permission sounded like pity, and pity in that room was poison. Asha took a deep breath. She knew if she broke now, if she cried or shouted or trembled, they would win again. So instead, she stood her ground and spoke clearly. She didn't rant, she didn't beg, she simply stated the fact. The design on the runway had been hers first, submitted in good faith and stolen without acknowledgement. The crowd didn't gasp in sympathy. They whispered in disbelief, some in amusement. It was easier for them to believe she was lying than to believe the queen had stolen a crown. What they weren't prepared for was what Asha pulled from her bag, a small USB drive. She announced calmly that she had proof, time-stamped emails, sketches, and original files that matched the piece currently being celebrated on the runway. There was no drama in her voice, only certainty. For a split second, Natasha's mask cracked, just slightly, but enough for Asha to see it. A nearby journalist, curious and sensing a shift in the air, offered a laptop. As Asha leaned in to connect the drive, the audience finally fell silent, not out of respect but curiosity. Something was happening that wasn't part of the script. And just then, at the far edge of the room, Asha saw him, her husband, entering with a quiet, purposeful stride, dressed simply but with a presence that turned heads without effort. He stood back, observing. He didn't interfere, not yet. But Asha knew. This was no longer her fall. It was the beginning of their reckoning. The silence in the showroom was unnatural, like the breath held before a storm. For the first time that evening, the spotlight was not on a model or a gown, but on Asha standing beside a fashion journalist's open laptop, the faint blue glow from the screen casting long shadows across her face. She inserted the USB drive with steady hands. Every eye in the room was either on her or on the monitors nearby, which were usually reserved for live streaming the runway. This time, something else was going to be broadcast. The files loaded quickly. There were folders labeled with exact dates, clearly named March Pitch Patchwork, Hand Embroidery Close-Up, Delhi Collab Draft. It was not just evidence, it was a record, a digital fingerprint of her creative soul mapped out across time. The journalist leaned closer, her expression shifting from polite skepticism to cold realization. She opened a PDF marked Original Submission and scrolled through the detailed sketches. There in black and white was the same motif currently walking the runway, the exact collar curve, the mirrored embroidery, the asymmetrical sleeve Asha had agonized over for days. The timestamp on the file was undeniable. It predated Eclat Vogue's launch announcement by nearly 3 months. A hushed murmur rippled across the audience like wind through tall grass. Natasha, still near the front row, remained frozen. Her smile hadn't fully disappeared, but it no longer reached her eyes. The performance she was so accustomed to delivering now faced a script she hadn't written. Asha's voice didn't rise, she didn't need volume. The content of her words cut sharper than any scream. She explained, calmly and methodically, how she had pitched this particular design to a boutique in Delhi. She even read from a copy of the email she had sent, a kind, hopeful message with her portfolio attached. The boutique had never responded, and now she suspected why. The screen showed a screenshot of the email thread. Her name, her words, her hopes, all laid bare in front of strangers who had, moments ago, laughed at her. People began whispering names, whispering them with intent. One influencer, until now recording quietly for his vlog, turned the camera directly on himself and announced, "Guys, this is big. This is not just drama, this is theft." The word hung in the air heavy. More people gathered around the laptop. One of Natasha's assistants stepped forward, nervously trying to change the subject by pointing toward the next sequence of the show. But nobody was paying attention to the models anymore. Even the PR team, always dressed in muted tones to blend into the backdrop, now stood awkwardly, waiting for instruction that wasn't coming. Then from the back of the room, Asha's husband stepped forward. Until now, he had watched silently, his expression unreadable. But his presence changed the energy in the room. He wasn't just another guest. He was someone powerful, someone known in industries where silence cost more than speech. A quiet wave of recognition passed through the back row. Whispers grew louder. Some knew his name, others only knew of the company he had built, the empire he owned, the contracts Natasha had once desperately sought. He didn't raise his voice either. He simply greeted the journalist, nodded toward the screen, and asked if she would kindly play the video file titled "Private Recording." The journalist hesitated, then clicked. A short video filled the monitor. It was grainy, clearly recorded without awareness, but the audio was clear. Natasha's voice filled the room. She was sitting at a table in a past meeting, perhaps a production meeting. She was laughing. "I mean, who's going to believe her? She's no one." She emailed a few scraps to a boutique. "We paid them off. The look's mine now. It's mine the moment I wear it." A cold gasp broke across the room like glass shattering. There it was, admission, arrogant, careless, damning. Natasha tried to speak, but her voice caught. She opened her mouth again, but couldn't shape a sentence. Her team stood motionless. The influencers no longer filmed discreetly. They pointed cameras at her directly now, some with delight, others with discomfort. No one came to her defense. A man from the Indian Fashion Federation stood up at the far end of the showroom. He didn't say a word, but he picked up his phone and walked toward the exit with sharp urgency. 2 fashion bloggers posted screenshots of the video within seconds. The hashtag #EclatExposed began to trend before the show had even ended. Asha stood in the center of it all, not triumphant, not vengeful, but calm. She hadn't come for revenge, she had come for the truth, and now truth had done what she could not. It had made them listen. Natasha turned, her face a perfect blend of disbelief and fury, and walked out of the showroom without another word. No press photos, no final bow. In her absence, the room didn't collapse, it transformed. Designers who had once turned their backs on Asha now approached her, speaking in low tones, trying to apologize or align themselves with her. Journalists asked for exclusive statements. Brand representatives asked to connect later, off the record. Even Priya, who had watched from the side in frozen silence, moved as if to approach, then stopped, sensing it was already too late. Asha didn't rush. She closed her files, thanked the journalist, and packed away the USB. Her husband met her halfway through the crowd. He said nothing. He didn't need to. As they walked out of the room together, flashbulbs followed. But this time, the light didn't burn her. It simply illuminated what had always been true. They hadn't broken her. They'd only shown her how to rise. The following day, the aftershocks from the showroom incident rippled far beyond the velvet curtain walls of Eclat Vogue. The fashion world had woken up to something it rarely acknowledged: accountability. Asha had not only turned the narrative, but punctured the bubble of curated illusions that giants like Natasha Verma floated in for years. Still, the world needed more than spectacle. They needed substance. And that was exactly what Asha had come prepared for. She entered the headquarters of the Indian Fashion Federation quietly, without entourage, dressed once again in her usual understated cut, this time iron crisp, every button deliberate. The receptionist recognized her immediately but hesitated. Whatever gossip had traveled since last night had reached even the marbled lobbies of power, but Asha didn't wait for protocol. She asked to meet the ethics committee, and to her surprise, they were already expecting her. In a glass-walled boardroom that had seen more flattery than truth, Asha sat across from a panel of composed, well-dressed individuals. Lawyers, senior designers, legal advisors to the Federation. They had seen controversies before, but this one felt different. It wasn't a whisper behind closed doors, it was a wildfire burning through public feeds. Asha opened her laptop and began to present. There were no dramatics, she simply let the documents speak. First, the dated sketches, clear, intricate, and consistent with the designs on Eclat Vogue's runway. Then came emails, dozens of them. Sent proposals, concept notes, mood boards, all addressed to the same boutique Natasha had once loosely partnered with. That boutique was now under scrutiny, and its silence only added fuel to the fire. The most devastating piece came next. A chain of internal emails leaked anonymously that very morning. They had arrived in Asha's inbox without warning, but she suspected where they came from. Someone from inside Eclat Vogue had finally decided to speak. The emails were between Natasha and her lead producer. The tone was dismissive, mocking. Phrases like "get the embroidery cleaned up" and "scrub her watermark" left little ambiguity. Natasha hadn't just copied Asha's design. She had orchestrated its theft, polished the edges, and passed it off as original innovation. The Federation members leaned forward as Asha read one particular line aloud. "She's just another stitched-up sob story. By the time she figures it out, we'll have already turned it into a global campaign." Silence settled over the room again, only this time it wasn't surprise. It was calculation. These were people who understood the cost of scandal. The legal advisor glanced toward the senior ethics chair and gave a slow nod. But Asha wasn't finished. From her bag, she produced a set of printed contracts, old but still valid. They were NDAs and vendor agreements from the boutique she had worked with, and though they'd never officially accepted her pitch, they had archived her files. That meant her work was under protection. Her name, her timestamps, and their negligence all formed a legal triangle Natasha couldn't escape from. The ex-lawyer of Eclat Vogue, now operating independently after being quietly released months ago, had joined Asha moments earlier. He sat beside her, nodding periodically, confirming every claim with quiet authority. He'd seen the same thing happen to other young creatives, but they had disappeared without noise. Asha, he said later, was the first one who did fold. The committee moved quickly. A formal inquiry was opened. An emergency notice was issued to suspend Natasha from all Federation-affiliated events and projects. It wasn't a permanent ruling, not yet, but it was the first domino, and everyone knew what came next. Outside the building, press had begun to gather. Word had leaked that Asha had gone to the Federation directly, and reporters were now waiting like hawks, not for gossip, but for truth confirmed in ink. She left the building not as a victim, but as a witness bearing proof. Her husband waited in the car, calm as ever, scrolling through early morning headlines. He showed her one without speaking. It was from an international fashion magazine. From shadows to spotlight, Asha's battle against fashion's theft culture. But this wasn't just a scandal now, it was a shift. Already, a small but growing wave of independent designers had begun tagging her in posts, sharing their own experiences. Some were too afraid to name names. Others credited her directly for giving them courage. A quiet revolution was brewing, not one of outrage, but of reclamation. Later that evening, in an unexpected twist, one of Eclat Vogue's former PR managers broke her silence on a live podcast. She confirmed what many had feared. Natasha had stolen ideas before, not once, many times, but it had always been brushed under the rug with money, influence, or fear. No one had ever come with this much proof. No one had ever had the backing Asha now did. The podcast went viral. By midnight, the Federation's servers crashed under traffic. Screenshots of Asha's email timestamps, sketches, and the leaked video played on a loop across fashion blogs and influencer reels. And while the world buzzed and unraveled the fabric Natasha had so carefully sewn around herself, Asha remained composed. She didn't gloat. She didn't respond to every mention. She simply prepared. Because the takedown was only the first half of the story. What came next was the rebuilding. And this time, no one would own her work but her. The collapse didn't happen overnight, but it was swift enough to stun even those closest to Natasha Verma. The morning after the Federation's inquiry went public, the headquarters of Eclat Vogue was unusually quiet. The usual bustle of stylists, assistants, and junior designers was replaced by hushed voices, nervous glances, and unopened emails. The office, once a palace of curated chaos and artificial glamour, now felt like a showroom built on sand. Natasha didn't show up. She hadn't returned calls since the live podcast aired the night before. Her face, once ubiquitous across fashion spreads and interviews, had vanished from every brand account within hours. Her social media pages were locked, comments were disabled. Her silence, once interpreted as elegant mystery, now felt like guilt dressed in luxury. The investors were the first to move. An emergency board meeting was convened via video call. The largest investor, a European fashion conglomerate that had quietly funded Eclat Vogue's international expansion, issued a statement. "We do not condone or support unethical practices. We are reviewing our association." The statement hit the press within the hour. Sponsorship deals began falling like dominoes. A high-profile skincare brand pulled out of a year-long collaboration, citing a misalignment in values. A magazine cover featuring Natasha, scheduled for release the following month, was scrapped mid-production. Influencers who had once fawned over her collections now began deleting posts, issuing carefully worded disclaimers, distancing themselves from the label like it carried a contagion. Inside the company, the rot spread quickly. Employees who had once fought to be near Natasha now whispered about NDAs and toxic work culture. A few began leaking anonymous stories to journalists, tales of interns being unpaid, of young designers' ideas being mysteriously recycled, of burnout masked as ambition. The glamour had peeled away, revealing something hollow beneath. By midweek, the PR team resigned en masse. Without them, Eclat Vogue's image was left unattended. The brand's last Instagram post, an ad featuring one of Asha's stolen designs, became a war zone of comments. Thief, plagiarism, boycott. Every hour brought more tags, more stories, more exposure. The Federation's formal suspension notice was published that Friday. Natasha Verma was barred from showcasing at any affiliated fashion week for the next 24 months, pending full investigation. It wasn't just a ban, it was a public exile. For someone who had built her identity around being untouchable, this was the kind of scar that didn't fade easily. Her closest allies began disappearing too. Priya, who had once stood at Natasha's side at every launch party and campaign shoot, quietly deleted every photo of them together. Other collaborators removed Eclat Vogue's name from their portfolios. Clients demanded refunds. Lawsuits began circling. Asha, meanwhile, said little. She watched the unraveling from a distance, not with vengeance but with clarity. She had done her part. The rest was consequence catching up. What struck her most was not the speed of Natasha's fall, but the emptiness it revealed. Without the arrogance, without the spectacle, there was nothing of substance. Natasha had never truly created, she had only curated, borrowed, and silenced. The empire had always been built on other people's brilliance, repackaged under her name. Now that name was poison. By the end of the month, the Eclat Vogue studio lights were dimmed permanently. The staff were let go with severance packages and non-disclosure agreements. No farewell email, no press conference, just an abrupt end. Natasha was last seen boarding a private flight out of Mumbai alone, her face shielded, her destination unknown. And the space she left behind. It didn't stay empty for long. The old world had crumbled, but Asha wasn't standing in its ruins. She was already building something new. It began not in a showroom or a press release, but in a quiet, sunlit co-working space on the edge of the city, far from the glass towers where fashion decisions were made by committees. Here, surrounded by fresh paint, recycled wood tables, and the soft scent of chai, Asha took the first steps toward something entirely her own. She named the label Neve, meaning foundation. It wasn't just a brand, it was a philosophy. Neve would stand for what Eclat Vogue had buried: originality, transparency, and the quiet strength of designers who had been pushed to the margins. Asha didn't want noise, she wanted authenticity. Her vision was clear: collections would be co-created with artisans from rural India, design credits would be shared openly, and every garment would carry the story of the hands that made it. The fashion world watched with curiosity at first. They weren't sure what to expect. Many assumed she would try to become the next Natasha, big, bold, dominant. But Asha wasn't interested in replacing anyone. She wasn't fighting for a seat at a poisoned table. She was building her own. Her first hires weren't headhunters or ex-luxury consultants. They were survivors, young interns, junior pattern makers, and textile artists who had once worked under exploitative bosses or had been forced to abandon the industry altogether. Asha welcomed them not as staff but as co-creators. Their ideas were invited. Their names were included in credits. She created a space where critique wasn't punishment, it was growth. There were no marble floors, no espresso machines, no giant branding banners. But there was joy. There was music during late-night sketch sessions, laughter between fittings, tears too when the first full prototype, a simple cotton sari with hand-woven borders, came back from the artisan village with a note of thanks from the weaver's daughter. That note was framed and placed above Asha's desk. When the first lookbook for Neve was released online, it didn't trend immediately. It was subtle, soft-focus images of real people, not models: a grandmother in a linen kurta, a student in a reworked denim sari, a potter's wife in a sari with earth-toned borders. The designs weren't revolutionary in form, but they were revolutionary in honesty. And then something unexpected happened. A review appeared in a global fashion magazine, not a paid feature, but an editorial piece written by a respected critic. In a world addicted to spectacle, Neve offers something deeply radical: stillness. Asha has created not just a label, but a language, one stitched with intention, clarity, and memory. That piece opened the floodgates. International buyers reached out. Sustainable fashion forums featured her story. Designers from Kenya, Peru, and Vietnam messaged her privately, calling Neve a blueprint for what fashion could be. But the greatest moment of affirmation didn't come from Fashion Week or press. It came on a quiet morning when a group of young fashion students arrived at her office without appointments, clutching sketchbooks, eyes wide with both fear and admiration. One of them, a girl no older than 20, stammered, "We saw what you did, and we wanted to know if we could learn from you, even sweep the floor, anything." Asha didn't smile out of pride, she smiled out of recognition. That had once been her. She invited them inside and told them what no one had told her: what mattered was not belonging to the industry, but belonging to yourself. As the months passed, Neve didn't explode, it expanded, slowly and deliberately. Asha rejected offers for fast retail rollouts. She declined invitations to join glossy award shows hosted by the same people who had once shunned her. She preferred something smaller, something real. And yet word spread. Boutiques in Tokyo, Amsterdam, and Melbourne began to carry limited lines. Asha was invited to speak at design schools, not about fashion, but about resilience, intellectual property, and the courage to walk away from what looks like success but smells like compromise. Somewhere along the way, the same people who had laughed at her at Eclat Vogue's showroom began using words like visionary and authentic. But Asha didn't need their validation anymore. She had rebuilt herself from the inside out. The space she had been denied was now hers to define. And when the first annual Neve showcase was held, not in a hall, but in an open courtyard surrounded by trees and handmade lanterns, there was no red carpet, no photographers yelling names. There was just light, fabric, and a quiet crowd watching beauty take shape not as spectacle, but as soul. Asha stood beneath a simple awning, hands ink-stained from blocking a last-minute design as her team took their bow, not behind her, but beside her. This was not a comeback. It was a beginning. The world had come full circle. Asha stood before the audience, her heart beating steadily against the quiet pulse of the room. The vast, luminous ballroom was filled with fashion's finest: designers, influencers, journalists, celebrities, and industry veterans. A high-profile event, the Global Fashion Innovators Gala, had selected Asha to receive an award for outstanding contribution to sustainable fashion. The very same world that had once cast her aside was now honoring her, and the irony wasn't lost on her. But it wasn't pride that filled her chest, it was gratitude. A gratitude that came from the hard road she'd walked and the people who had helped her carry the weight. As she approached the podium, the audience, who had once dismissed her as just another name to be stolen, now looked to her for leadership. The room was silent, every eye focused, waiting. She smiled softly, a quiet calm in the midst of an overwhelming moment. She wasn't here to boast. She wasn't here to explain her victory. She was here to share a message. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady. "Thank you for this incredible honor, but I want to start by telling you a story." The audience shifted, intrigued. She paused, gathering the words she needed. There was no need to talk about the past. Everyone in this room knew the details. The headlines had already spilled the story of Eclat Vogue's fall and her rise, but this wasn't about that moment. It was about the years in between. "When I first entered the fashion world, I thought it was my dream," she continued. "I thought if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet, played by the rules, maybe I could carve out a space for myself. But there's a truth that took me far too long to learn. The rules weren't made for me, and they weren't made for many others either." She glanced at the faces in the crowd, the ones who had spent their careers playing by those rules. The fashion industry as we know it was built on an illusion of beauty that didn't represent all of us, an illusion of exclusivity that silenced voices, that silenced the very people who have been the backbone of this industry. The artisans, the laborers, the designers who create for the sake of creating, not for a brand name, but for a story. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time she saw something shift in the room. Some were nodding, some were looking inward. She wasn't just talking about herself anymore, she was speaking to a larger truth. She continued, the system that rewarded imitation and celebrity over originality and heart is broken. But you know what? It can be rebuilt. It will be rebuilt. But not by continuing to repeat the same mistakes. Not by reinforcing the idea that fame equals talent or that money equals value. It'll be rebuilt by people who dare to create with integrity, who dare to be bold enough to stand against the pressure, and who refuse to let others define their worth. The applause was tentative at first, unsure if they were meant to cheer for her words or the act of simply being in the room with someone who had dared to speak them. She lifted her hand, signaling for calm. This isn't my redemption story. I've heard that term thrown around a lot, and I can tell you there's no redemption for me. The only redemption I seek is for the industry, the one that forgets its roots, its people, and its true purpose. My work is not done. Her gaze swept across the audience, meeting the eyes of her friends, mentors, and a few familiar faces she hadn't seen in years, faces that once believed in her before the world did. She could see the pride in their eyes, but there was something else too, a shared understanding that this was bigger than any single award or achievement. This was a movement. This was the true shift that had been quietly brewing in the fabric of the fashion world. Asha paused, collecting herself before continuing. I stand here not because I've beaten anyone or because I've proven someone wrong. I stand here because, together with every person who has supported me, we've proved that it is possible to create something beautiful, something meaningful, and something real without compromising who we are. As she spoke, a sense of clarity filled her. She had come full circle, not just as a designer, but as a leader who understood the price of success. She understood that the highest achievements weren't measured by revenue or followers, but by the impact on the people and communities she touched. The applause this time was not tentative, it was loud, it was heartfelt. Asha stepped back from the podium, her heart swelling as she caught a glimpse of the familiar faces in the crowd, the interns from her early days at Neve, the artisans who had become family, and even those young designers who had walked the long path behind her. And for the first time, she didn't feel the weight of the fight. She felt the strength of the journey. Later that evening, after the gala had wrapped and the last of the guests had left, Asha stood by the open balcony of the hotel. The city's skyline was a quiet reflection of the glimmering stars above, and she felt, for the first time in years, a deep peace. She was no longer the girl who had been humiliated at Eclat Vogue's runway, nor the woman who had struggled to regain her place in a world that had tried to shut her out. She was someone entirely different, someone who had taken all of the pain, the loss, and the betrayal, and woven it into something greater. Asha wasn't defined by the past. She wasn't defined by others' attempts to diminish her. She was defined by her own heart, her vision, and the incredible people who believed in her. And as she looked out into the night, she knew there was no such thing as an ending, not for her, and certainly not for the movement she had ignited.